All right, the record reflects we are back in session. Department counsel are present, and members are adjourned, and our alternates are present. Witnesses present. Mr. McGee, you may continue your examination.
Thank you, Ryan. Now, Mrs. Ryan, when we were talking earlier before lunch, we listed out the different things that you tested. And I went through, I believe, 5 or 6 items. But there were more that you tested, correct?
There were, yes.
And you recommended that we do a MVAC testing of the sweatpants that were found with the panties as well?
Yes.
And that was item A1?
Yes, that's correct.
And so you did the MVAC testing of that?
I did.
And you cut out the filter?
I did.
And you labeled that as A1A?
Correct.
And that was also sent on to Bodie Selmark?
It was, yes.
And you also tested item E12, which is described as the 3 red straps.
Right, correct.
And it had kind of like a black hook in it, I believe.
I believe so, yes. It's been a little while since I looked at the photos, but that sounds accurate.
We're showing you a photo of E12. Would that maybe help refresh your memory of that
Yes.
item? This photograph, I believe you took.
Okay. Yes,
Does that refresh your memory?
it does.
And that item you also tested with or processed with your MVAC,
I did.
and you cut out the filter,
I did.
and then you labeled that filter
Yes.
E12A, I assume?
Yes,
And
correct.
that was also forwarded to Bodie Selmark?
Yes, it was.
Now, as we discussed, your involvement in this case was more than just sampling, right? You are our consultant.
That's correct.
And so after the items are sent off to Bodie Selmark, we have results from those tests, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you reviewed those results and discussed with me what it showed.
Yes.
And you kind of educated me on what it showed. Would that be fair to say?
Yes.
And you had to describe like what an analytical threshold was and everything, and explain what all that was.
Yes.
And then we saw what Don Jones testified to were E-grams.
Correct. I call them electropharograms, but I guess it's easier to say E-grams.
Yeah, it's easier. And you explained to me what those were showing.
Right.
And based on Bodie's analytical threshold, you said there might be more information available than what Bodie is finding in their results.
Right. Basically, I looked at the electropharograms, and I also asked for the electronic DNA data because I do have the specialized software to be able to analyze the DNA. And so I reviewed that, and I just let you know that there was some DNA present that was below what we call the analytical or reporting threshold. So there was something present, a peak, looked like possible DNA, but below the level where Bodie would call that as a real or true DNA type.
And there was more than one peak, right?
Yes, multiple peaks with multiple samples.
And so you had to explain to me that each machine, is it fair to say each machine has a different analytical threshold?
It can either be each machine or each type of instrument. So there are different analytical instruments. And yes, each laboratory needs to, that's part of the validation that we talked about earlier. You determine, when I run this data, at what level can I be confident that I'm not seeing noise or background information? Where can I be confident that it's a true DNA type? And those will vary between instruments.
And that's an analysis based on human analysis, correct?
Right, that would be what we call manual interpretation of the data.
And at some point during the discussion in your evaluation, you made a suggestion. Do you remember that, of what we should do with the electronic data?
Well, I said that since much of the data, not all, but much of the data that was present from the analysis performed by Bodie, much of it was below the analytical threshold. I had said, they are bound by their analytical thresholds, their validation studies, as all labs are. There is a way to look at lower level data using something called probabilistic genotyping. And that involves computerized software that has been designed to be able to look at that lower level data. And I suggested that the attorneys contact a company called Cybergenetics, because they have a program called TrueAllele that they will take electronic DNA data from other laboratories and analyze it with their probabilistic genotyping.
And you figured based on that, we'd get maybe a more extensive profile or information from what was extracted from the items that you processed.
Yes.
And then you were informed of that we were able to actually send items off to Cybergenetics, correct?
So the electronic DNA data was sent, the items themselves were not sent, just the results, basically.
And then we were able to get results back from Cybergenetics.
Yes,
And you reviewed those as well.
I did.
And based on all the results that came back, and we'll have further testimony from the people that did those tests and those results. But based on the results you learned from them, there was some DNA.
Objection, hearsay, Sanchez.
But it's going to offer proof for her testimony as expert for us, and they'll be subject to those witnesses coming in.
Your offer of proof is that there's going to be someone from
Bodie
the lab testifying and Cybergenetics people testifying to their results.
Those are the next two witnesses, yes.
All right, based on the offer of proof, the objection is overruled.
And you learned from the results that some of the items, just from Bodie, had DNA markers on them.
Right. Some of the results, some of the samples that Bodie tested, they were able to report a partial profile or a mixture. There were some DNA types that did reach their analytical threshold.
And they were able to at least say what those results were, correct?
Yes.
Now, was it a full profile, like you can know everything about the DNA found on those items?
No, they were what we call partial profiles. So the laboratory looked at 22 loci, and they were not able to get results at all of those loci or locations that were tested.
And I think I asked you if you could tell if that's degraded or DNA, and your opinion was that's for them to testify. Would that be fair?
Yes, since it's not my results or my instrumentation, I feel that that's something that they can probably better opine on.
So the items that came back with at least some DNA from Bodie's cell mark were which items?
That would be the left cup of the black bra, as well as my item E11A, which was a white electrical, a white cord. Those both had partial DNA profiles. And additionally, it would be my item, sorry.
There's some on both bras, correct? The left and the right?
Yes, both sides of the bra, and then also my item E25A, which was a red strap.
And then
That had one reportable, excuse me. That was also a partial DNA profile.
So Bodie found it partial on 4 items, correct?
Yes.
And then TrueAllele came back saying, we've identified more DNA that may kind of develop a profile. profile?
Well, I mean, the DNA, they didn't do any additional testing. They're just looking at the data itself. They were able to look at a lower level than the analytical threshold set by Bodie because they were using computerized software that is designed to do that. So when they did that, yes, at a lower level, there are additional DNA types present.
Now, when you saw the results come back from Bodie, were you surprised?
I mean, frankly, somewhat, yes, just because I had never really dealt with samples that had been buried for this length of time. I wasn't sure if we'd be able to get any DNA results from these samples. The results that we were getting, I would say, would be, if we were to get any results at all, it would be kind of consistent with what I would expect, low level, partial, some dropout in the profiles.
And was some of the reason you're surprised is because there's just not studies showing if DNA can even last that long?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
I would say yes. You know, again, I tried to do as much research as I could into the subject of how the persistence of DNA, touch DNA after it's been buried, and there really isn't much research out there at all.
But based on what Bodie did with their higher up analytical threshold, they were able to recover DNA from both graves.
Objection. This states the testimony regarding the analytical threshold of Bodie hasn't been established.
Okay. Based on the analytical threshold of Bodie and the manual interpretation, they were able to find partial DNA in both graves, and half the problems found out that
Objection leading.
it's an expert.
Right, so DNA was detected above their analytical threshold on the 4 samples that we previously discussed.
I'm going to read that to prosecution and not have a discussion in front of the jury about my direct examination, so loud that I can hear it.
You're going to be consulting among yourselves. It needs to be covered.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat your answer? I didn't hear it.
Sure. So Bodie was able to produce reportable results, meaning those results were above the analytical threshold for the 4 samples previously discussed.
And just so we're clear, could you define or just explain what a partial profile actually means?
Right. So again, it's when you don't get results at all of the locations that are tested. Bodie used a kit called Global Filer. It has 22, well, a total of 24 loci, but 2 of those are specific to males. And if you don't get results at 22 loci, then that's considered a partial profile. It means that there was probably a very low amount of starting material, or it's degraded.
And it's a partial profile usually come up when you see something like a trace contributor or a minor contributor maybe in like a different sample that's been testified like in a mixture.
That can occur, yes.
Like a trace may say, we call it a trace because it's a low amount and it only hits 2 loci or loci. Or
Right, that would be a partial component of a mixture, yes.
Now I'm going to switch over to the DNA that was located inside the Isuzu Trooper.
Okay.
Before you do that,
Yeah.
on the 4 items, Bodie tested where there were results above the analytical threshold?
Yes, some, yes.
On the 4 items, out of the 22 loci that they tested, how many of the loci did they get results on for each of the items?
Okay,
And
I will
the
have,
checklist that you're seeing, Sanchez.
Well, they're going to be tested on, based on the audit, proofs and the objections of the rules.
Thank you.
okay. So the white cord, which is E11A, there were results at 4 of the loci that were above reporting threshold.
I understand.
Okay. For the black bra, and this would be the left cup. 9 loci showed results above threshold. For A25A, the red strap, results at 4 loci. And the right cup of the bra, loci.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Onto the DNA at the Isuzu Cooper. We covered the swabs from the steering wheel at 36. We know that came back to the minor contributor to Charles Merritt. F37, the swabs of the center console stuff, the gear shift, came back as a possible trace contributor of Charles Merritt. F39, which was the swabs taking of the front passenger interior door handle. You know what item I'm referring to?
I do, yes.
The testimony of Don Jones says it was too complex for manual interpretation. Did you review his report on that determination?
Yes.
Did he change his analysis and conclusion during his interpretation?
It did appear to me that initially he was interpreting the sample, and I base this on his notes on his electropharogram. He had interpreted a minor contributor profile and then later noted that there might be 4 people present, which would make it too complex to interpret.
Can you explain what it means if they have like 3 possible contributors versus 4, what that means, and then I'll ask the second follow-up question after that.
So the more individuals you have potentially in a sample, in a mixture, the more complicated or complex it is to interpret that profile and be confident that you're not including somebody incorrectly or excluding somebody incorrectly. So sometimes it gets to a point with manual interpretation methods that you simply have to call it as inconclusive because you want to be conservative and not include somebody that shouldn't actually be there. And that's, one of the issues, I suppose, with manual interpretation is there are different analysts interpret a mixture in different ways. If the profile was actually of 3 individuals and that assumption was made that, okay, this is 3 people, not more than 3, then it's my opinion that that profile could have been interpreted.
And when Mr. Jones and yourself are looking at F39 swab results, is it fair to say Mr. Jones had to follow his policies and procedures that are set up for his lab?
Absolutely, sure.
And did you receive a copy of those?
I did.
And would your interpretation be following those same policy and procedures for his lab, to be fair?
I believe so. It is somewhat difficult because I'm not working in that lab. His policies and procedures were not very detailed, I would say, but I did note that they are following SWIG-DAM, which is the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods. They're following SWIG-DAM recommendations, and when you follow those recommendations, then you can make, if you are confident that there are a set number of individuals, you are allowed to make assumptions about the data and use lower level data. So since that lab is following SWIG-DAM guidelines, I do believe that interpreting the profile as having a major contributor, a mid-level contributor, and a trace contributor would be appropriate.
And for the record, can you spell the acronym SWIG-DAM?
Sure. SWGDAM.
Now, if you followed SWIG-DAM and said it was 3 contributors, was it clearly defined that there was a major contributor to that mixture?
Objection. This states your testimony on examination.
Looking at the mixture, yes, I did believe there was a major contributor to the mixture. And I would say that that was supported by the bench notes of the analyst and the technical or second reader. And that major contributor was, in my opinion, was consistent with Joseph McStay.
And you said there was other contributors. Would you say there's a minor contributor?
Looking at the data, it appeared to me to be a major contributor, what we call a mid-level contributor. So not quite as much DNA as the major contributor, but clearly above a very low trace level contributor. And so the trace level contributor, I don't believe you can interpret or do anything much with that very low trace level contributor.
And the mid-level contributor, can you associate the door handle on the passenger side with any individual?
Yes, in my opinion, looking at the mid-level contributor, it did appear to be consistent with Mr. Merritt's DNA profile.
Now, looking at the decision that Mr. Jones made to say, well, it could be 4 contributors, is that supported, that assumption is supported by anything you see in the data?
I did not see any evidence of 4 contributors. I would agree that some of the data was very low level, but the maximum number of DNA types observed at any one particular area would be consistent with there being 3 contributors. So that's basically one of the ways we determine how many contributors could be present in this mixture. And we also look at something called peak heights and determine if the types that are present could basically go together. They could be sister alleles. So looking at the profile overall, I did not see anything that would indicate 4 contributors.
So in your professional opinion, can you make certain conclusions about the DNA that was found at the different locations inside the Isuzu Trooper? Namely, the steering wheel, the center console, and now the passenger inside the door.
Well, the first 2 of those, I would agree with the reported results that Mr. Merritt's DNA does appear to be present on the steering wheel. It appears he has DNA consistent with the DNA types with the very trace contributor in the center console area. And the passenger door, it does look to me, in my interpretation of the data, that his DNA is present, or DNA consistent with him is present as that mid-level contributor.
Is it fair to say all 3 locations have a mixture?
Yes.
Now, DNA from this mixture, can you look at it and date it when it actually was placed at that location?
No.
It could be there for a minute, it could be there for an hour, it could be for a year?
Yes, there's no way to tell, if somebody just cleaned off the steering wheel or something like that, then that's, the only way to determine when the DNA was applied, but really there's no way to tell.
Is there any way to tell how DNA found its way to a location?
When we're talking about touch or transfer DNA, no, there isn't.
And again, we're talking about touch and transfer. What kind of cells are we talking about?
Mostly skin cells. It could also be small amounts of saliva from a person touching their face or coughing on their hands. It could be DNA brought to the surface from sweat. We're not really sure exactly, where it's coming from, but it's DNA that is on the hands that is transferred when contact occurs.
And based on your review of the DNA, the mixtures that are found on location, is it reasonable, do you agree with John Jones' opinion that it's reasonable that this DNA can be secondary transferred throughout the vehicle?
Yes.
Is it reasonable it could have been placed there on February 4th?
Yes.
Is it reasonable it could have been placed there on February 3rd?
Yes.
Or February 1st?
Yes.
Or January 31st?
Yes.
Or back in December of 2009, when it was testified that Mr. Merritt was in the vehicle?
Yes.
Objection, this state's testimony. I haven't heard any testimony about that.
In the statement.
That's not testimony. We'll just strike that last answer. Move to strike that last answer, please.
Would it be consistent with the evidence presented that Mr. Merritt was inside the vehicle on December of 2009, that evidence or that DNA could still be present if it was not cleaned and sterilized as you described?
Yes, it could be.
Now, part of your opinion is based on, I assume, your experience doing DNA analysis for 20 years.
Yes.
It's also based on other studies that you researched on the subject as well.
Yes.
And one of the studies was a 2017 study that you reviewed, correct, in the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine. I think it was titled
Yes.
Increased Recovery of Touch DNA Evidence Using FTA Paper Compared to Conventional Collection Methods.
Yes, that's correct.
And that was written by Kurt.
Kirgiz, Kirgiz.
Perfect. And that one dealt with steering wheel.
Yes.
And what part of that study did you find important for your opinion?
Well, it was important because, number one, it was dealing with DNA from steering wheels. And what they found was that the last driver of the vehicle tended to be the major contributor. So I believe it was 29 out of 32 instances where the last driver was the major. In some instances, the person was a co-major, and in only one was the last driver, the minor contributor.
It's also clear that the majority of samples contain a mixture of DNA.
That's correct, yes. The vast majority could have been, I believe it was about 88% of the samples actually showed mixtures of DNA on the steering wheel, which really is not surprising based upon what we know about transfer, people picking up DNA on their hands from various objects or people.
Did you find another study important for you in the Australian Journal of Forensic Medicine that was published in February of 2019?
Yes.
And that was one that was DNA, titled DNA Within Cars, prevalence of DNA from driver, passenger, and others on steering wheel.
Correct.
Written by Boyko, B-O-Y-K-O.
Yes.
And what part of that study did you find important for your opinion?
So with that study, although it was a small scale study, what they did was focus on vehicles that there was only one driver for the past 30 days. It had been the same driver. And even though there was only one driver in those 30 days, they found that 14 out of the 20 sites sampled contained mixtures of DNA. And the mixtures could be attributed to associates, to people they lived with. So other individuals that were known to them were showing up on the steering wheel even though that person had not driven the car in at least 30 days.
And it also showed people that are also passengers showing up on the steering wheel as well.
That's correct. So they also looked at who had ridden in the vehicle, who was a passenger in the vehicle, and at times that person's DNA was showing up on the steering wheel, even though again they had not driven that vehicle.
Some DNA was from passengers, some was from known associates that were not in the vehicle.
Correct.
Did they also find DNA they don't know where it came from?
Yes.
How often did they find that?
Well, frankly, I don't remember the number of individuals that were not one of the known associates, but they were finding mixtures in multiple samples, and it was not uncommon for them to find someone who they couldn't determine whose DNA that was.
And when they found those, they were all a minor contributor.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, the last study I want to mention to you is the one mentioned by Don Jones about the body farm in Tennessee. Are you certain which study he's referring to?
No, just because I don't recollect an author being mentioned, but I did find a study that was presented by researchers at the body farm in Tennessee. So I believe this is the same study that he had discussed, and that author was Emmons, I believe, E-M-M-O-N-S.
And what did that study really deal with?
So that particular study was dealing with cadavers and then determining can their DNA be detected in the soil underneath those bodies as they decomposed. My understanding from the article, based upon the title of the article, it was based on surface decomposition. So it appears that the bodies were on the surface and not buried. And again, they were looking at the soil. Did the person's DNA leach into the soil surrounding their bodies as they decomposed?
And that's a little different than when bodies are recovered from underground, that'd be fair to say.
Yes.
It's different from testing the soil that came in contact with the body versus other items that were looking for touch DNA.
I would say so, yes.
And did one thing they discover that was, what are some of the things in that study that you found important about how DNA maintains its integrity in relation to soil?
One of the things the authors had mentioned in that study was that similar to how DNA in a bone will kind of bind to the matrix of the bone, and that's often why we're able to get results from bones that have been buried for many years. The DNA is sort of protected in that matrix of the bone. They found that the DNA also could be bound to the soil and, in a sense, protected by the matrix of the soil.
So if an item that has touched DNA and is buried in soil, does that study lend to the idea that soil could help maintain the integrity of the DNA?
I would say that's a possibility. They did not study that directly, but it's certainly possible.
Is that kind of a leap too far at that point?
I would like to see a study on clothing or remains from clothing buried for 3 or 4 years. That study doesn't exist. So we have to go with what we have and try to read from that. I don't know how that would relate necessarily.
Final question, is it safe to say that based off of your processing of the items and the results from the analysis done by Bodie Selmar, that the presence of DNA on those items, on some of the items, is consistent with the detection of the traditional method done by Don Jones, where he also found some DNA left over on some of that?
Right, so while Mr. Jones was not able to get a DNA profile, as we discussed, there were a couple of samples where extremely low levels of DNA were detected. He was using a swabbing method and selecting kind of discrete areas, smaller areas. I was using a method that's more sensitive and testing the entire item. So it could be consistent that the reason we're getting results with the MVAC is because it's a more sensitive collection method, and I was able to test larger areas.
And I'm trying to pull this up just to kind of look at this. If I can have my overhead on my computer before. Sorry. We're looking again at Exhibit 994, and this shows the white extension cord. This extension cord clearly has like indentions down the length. Is that
Correct.
fair to say?
Yes.
What about those indentions do you think were helpful for using on the impact?
Well, I mean, even when I received the item, there was clearly still dirt and debris present in the vast majority of the sample. So using the MVAC, we have that water, that buffer, I should say, that's spraying down into, it would reach any of the cracks and crevices. If there was any DNA that was present from skin cells or what have you in the cracks and crevices of that extension cord, then we're going to have a much better chance of collecting that with the MVAC than with the cotton swab.
Looking at Exhibit 995, the panties, there's not a lot of that similar kind of thick material or crevices for a lot of DNA to hide, I guess. Would you agree?
Right. I mean, typically, many times clothing items are good candidates for MVAC testing. This one, I mean, you can kind of tell from the picture. It's very degraded. The fabric itself was very, very thin. So, I mean, there was still a possibility of collecting DNA. Just didn't see as much DNA in that particular sample.
Exhibit 996, which is the A3, which is the left bra cut from the grave. What about this item lends itself to using the MVAC on that?
Well, again, it's a clothing item, so any porous item can be, the MVAC can be beneficial because it's going to spray onto the surface. And if you think about, cloth or clothing, it's not the same as looking at this, wood, right? I mean, this coated wood. There are cracks and crevices microscopically, basically, in clothing items. So that liquid is spraying down into those cracks and crevices and potentially loosening and collecting the DNA.
Looking at 997 again, there's again another piece of that same electric cord. I assume the same theory applies to this part as well.
Yes, and I would say with the knot present in there, that may have better preserved or protected any DNA that was present.
If you don't know where exactly on that cord you were able to obtain DNA from. That's fair to say.
Right, that's correct. Since I did the entire item, I wouldn't be able to say where specifically the DNA was coming from. But this was an item that, since it had that knot in it, someone tied it, someone used pressure and friction potentially to, to tie that knot. And we know that pressure and friction tends to increase the amount of DNA that can be left behind when someone contacts something.
In 998, this is a little different piece. That's that red strap, correct?
Yes.
And does the MVAC work well on these types of items?
Yeah, again, you have a porous item, and then just the texture of the strap itself, where it's ridged. The liquid can get in between all of those ridges and areas and collect any possible DNA present.
And this strap is similar to the blue strap you demonstrated from here.
Yes.
And then lastly, exhibit 999 is just the right half of the bra, same as kind of the left, correct?
Correct, yes.
Nothing further.
Do you wish to start we're going to be taking our recess in about 15, 20 minutes, or did you wish to start your
I
process?
didn't realize we were recessing that. I can start Monday.
It's up to you.
Fine.
Okay,
I thought we were recessing at 3.
well, it's about 2:35 now.
I'll just start.
Want to start now?
It's okay.
Yeah, sure.
How much do you expect to be paid for your testimony here today?
Well, the rate for San Bernardino County is $2.25 per hour. So,
So $2.25 an hour for your testimony.
yeah, and travel time up here.
Travel time. And how much have you billed for doing that?
So far, I've built 31.2 hours, but I do have probably an additional 30 hours to bill.
So about 61.2.
Right. Oh, sorry. Yes,
Same rate.
at 225. Yes.
And same thing with all the phone calls, communications, $2.25 an hour.
Right, and that would be included in that estimate of hours that I said.
The total amount of money that you billed so far.
I've billed 31.2 hours for consultation, phone calls, review, and then the testing is separate. The MVAC testing is $900 per sample. I did do a 5% discount, so I think the total amount was about $7,600 for the MVAC testing.
You have a website that advertises your services,
I do.
and you use that for outreach to generate calls, generate visits, right?
Sure.
And on that website, you put videos on your website, right?
There are some, yes.
There are some of your TV appearances, right?
There are some, yes.
And you appeared on the Home Life Network, right? HLN.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes, HLN.
Did you forget?
I just had never heard it called Home Life Network, sorry.
Okay. And those are on cases that you didn't even have anything to do with, right? You were just talking head?
On that particular one, yeah, it was just talking about DNA in general, yes.
One or two? There are 2 HLN shows or one?
There were 2, but I was only there one time, and I wasn't paid for that.
Well, that's because it generates business, right? It's good for your business.
Sure, I guess so.
You guess so?
I mean, I haven't heard anyone specifically contact me because they saw me for a couple minutes on HLN, but it's possible, and that's why I have it on my website, sure.
Exposure's good, right?
Sure.
Sure. And you were on there with an interview with someone from experts.com.
Yes, they asked me to do a podcast or a webcast video, yes.
And you're on with a show called Marsha Clark Investigates the First 48 Hours.
Yes, no, that was a case I did do some review and testified in.
And the reason you put those on there is because it's exposure and it's good for your business, right?
Sure, I guess.
You guess?
Yeah,
Yes?
I don't know if it's good for my business, but it very well might be, so that's why I put it up there. Sure, yes.
So you put it up there because it might be good for business?
Yes.
Okay. Have you been interviewed for the defense documentary?
No.
They were filming you though at the break, right? At the lunch break?
They asked, yes, I was speaking with one of the attorneys and he asked if he could film and the attorney said that's fine and I just went along with it, sure.
And testifying in a high-profile case or case that's televised would be good for business, right?
It probably, I don't know, maybe, I'm not sure. I guess it depends on how well I do on the stand, so it could be.
Well, didn't you previously testify that it's basically free advertising?
Testifying in a high-profile case?
Yes.
I don't think I said that, I don't know, maybe I did.
Okay, we'll come back to that. So you don't know if you testified previously under oath that testifying in a high-profile case would be free advertising?
I don't remember specifically, but it is, I don't remember specifically, but certainly it's possible. I would not necessarily disagree with that.
It's actually better than free because you're getting paid to testify and you're getting advertising, you're getting exposure.
Objection, argumentative.
Well, is it better than free because you're getting paid when you testify?
Objection, argumentative.
Staying on that canvas forward.
So what you do as a consultant is you review documents. And you render an opinion, right?
As a consultant, yes.
And as a consultant, you review documents, render an opinion, and give that opinion to whoever your client is, usually a defense attorney, right?
Yes.
Most of your work comes from defense attorneys,
For the consulting, yes.
as opposed to the serology work.
As opposed to the MVAC collection and with DNA testing in the private lab, it's kind of about a 50-50 mix right now.
Okay. So all of your work as a consultant is with defense attorneys.
Generally, yes, because they have their expert that did the testing to talk with.
50% of your work, the MVAC is defense attorney.
No, about 50% of the DNA testing work in empirical forensics right now, it's about a 50-50 mix of defense and prosecution. The MVAC collection has been, the vast majority has been for law enforcement agencies.
So as a consultant, if you review documents and you render an opinion, and the attorney doesn't want to use your opinion, you don't get to testify, right?
That's true. I testify in about 10 to 15% of the cases that I consult on.
But some of them resolve short of trial, right? And so my question was, they don't like it, they don't have to use you, right?
Sure.
And if they don't use you, you don't get on television, or you don't get to testify in a high-profile case.
Objection, argumentative.
Your website that we discussed, for a long time, had a client list on it, right?
It was a totally different website. I redid it when I opened the MVAC collection serology
And
portion.
your client list used to be solely civil attorneys and criminal defense attorneys, right?
Probably, yeah, because again, that's,
Probably.
as it,
Do you not know?
I don't recall because it's been a number of years. As a consultant though, yeah, absolutely. Defense attorneys are who contacts me as a consultant. They're the ones who need someone to look at the DNA results.
And what you're trying to do is you're trying to find any errors, right?
Sure, well, I'm not trying to find them, trying to see if there are, and if there are, then that's something that needs to be addressed.
And in fact, you say on your website, how can you believe that the results in your case are error-free? And perhaps even more importantly, how can you catch an error before your client is facing jail? Right?
Sure,
Is that a yes?
yes.
In 2016, you gave a presentation to the National Defender Investigators Association, right?
Yes,
And the thrust of that was various possible defense strategies to help combat or mitigate the DNA match.
there was some of that, absolutely.
That's how it was built, right?
I don't recall. I'm agreeing with you that that was part of the presentation, and if it was billed that way, that it very well could have been.
Because that's your business, right?
That's part of my business, absolutely, yeah.
You're looking for any possible mistake or error in your review reports, right?
Absolutely.
And you try to do that based on the evidence that you're given, right?
Based on the bench notes and the electronic DNA data, and yes,
And as a scientist, you want to be as accurate and thorough as you possibly can be, right?
yes,
And you want to make sure you get it right, right?
that's the goal, sure.
And in fact, when you were showing us the little demonstration you did here, you're trying to be super thorough and accurate, right?
I mean, it was a demonstration. If it were accurate, again, I wouldn't be in a courtroom setting and I have a lab coat and things like that.
I understand.
Okay,
I guess my question is, you're a scientist and you want to be accurate and thorough, right?
yes,
And you prepare a report in this case.
I did.
You're trying to be as thorough and accurate as you can, right?
I tried to be, yes.
Okay. Now, with regard to the swabs of the trooper, one of the things you noted is that DNA can be moved around by a fingerprint brush.
It can be, yes.
You didn't mention that during your examination.
Objection, argumentative.
I wasn't asked. I certainly would answer just as I answered right now.
You also wrote that crime scene specialist Heather Radliff processed the trooper for fingerprints, and that latent print brushes and powders can inadvertently transfer DNA from one location to the other.
That's true.
And you wrote that she, Heather Radliff, swabbed the trooper for DNA.
Yes,
And you're reviewing a December 12th report?
I would have to look back to check the date.
Well, I'm going to show you this. It's actually dated December 3rd. Does that look like Miss Radliff's? Well, you flip through it. Let me know when you're done.
Okay.
Where does it say that Heather Radliff swabbed the trooper for DNA?
Objection, Your Honor. Should be testifying to hearsay.
I would want to look at the report. Not, I mean,
Okay, you
these
have
are
it
some
there
notes.
in your material?
I believe I do.
Okay.
So, I don't have all of the reports. The report I have is dated January 24th, 2014 by Heather Radliff. I didn't print them all out, so I would have to review.
December 12th, that's what you wrote in your report, is the one you reviewed, right?
There very well could have been one dated December 12th. There were multiple reports.
That wasn't my question. My question was, did you review the December 12th, 2013 report as you indicated in your report?
Yes,
And you have that here.
no,
You don't have the December 12th,
No.
2013 report?
no,
You have the December 3rd, 2013 report.
no. I have it on my iPad, but I don't have it printed out.
Great. Is your iPad here?
Yep,
I'm sorry?
yes. Want me to get it?
Yeah, please.
downloaded.
Okay. Would it surprise you that if I told you the head of the lab didn't swab the trooper for DNA?
No objection, Your Honor. Now, counsel's testifying. Your proper questions.
Well, we'll come back to that. The court wants to break here.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take our evening recess at this time until Monday, and I understand you can't be here until 1:30 on Monday.
Yes, if that's okay with the court.
I think we can look at it. I think the sense indicated you could have another witness in the morning.
Correct.
Later, Rob, as far as testimony.
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as the jury's concerned, we'll be in recess until 9:30 Monday morning. We should have a full week other than Thursday afternoon. So we'll be back Monday morning, 9:30 in the morning. Keep in mind the admonitions not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case. And we'll schedule that at 9:30 Monday morning. We'll see you back at 1:30 in the afternoon.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?